Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to have a bit of a rant. I normally try to control my desire to rant about things that annoy me. But today I'm going to rant a little bit, and I'm not ranting at anyone in particular. There's just a general tendency in language learning these days that drives me up the wall, and I thought I would rant about it a little bit today. Basically, it drives me up the wall when people say that the best way to learn a language, maybe the only decent way to learn a language, is to learn it like a child. You may be a 37-year-old man or a 54-year-old woman, doesn't matter. Learn the language as if you were an 18-month-old child. Wow, what is going on with this? I think we would all agree that small children usually do a pretty good job of learning their own native languages. Only small children actually can learn their own native languages, if that makes sense. Because if you start learning a language when you're, 14, then by definition, it isn't your native language anymore. But yes, little kids seem to get it. Every psychologically normal human being will learn, I suppose, at least one language to some sort of native-like level when they're a kid. There are probably complex cases in which people are exposed to different languages when they grow up. Maybe their parents emigrate, take children with them, so child A who's learning Polish up until that age ends up learning English in Britain from that age. I've known people like that. I've known people who are, if you like, linguistically complex in terms of what exactly counts as their native language. But those relatively unusual cases to one side, everyone does a pretty damn good job of learning their own language. Wouldn't it be nice if we could duplicate that when we were older? Wouldn't it be nice to learn a language in such an effortless fashion? There's a misconception here, of course. The misconception is that children don't make any conscious effort to learn their own languages, that they just soak everything up like a sponge. My understanding is that that's not true. Of course, children make a gigantic cognitive effort to learn their own native languages. But certainly, as we get older, we lose any particular sense that we ever had to make that effort. As far as we can make out, as adults or as teenagers, we just know our language and it's always been that way. So there's certainly something about this idea that it would be great to learn language like a child that is very appealing. The other thing about learning a language once you are a bit older, a bit longer in the tooth, is that, of course, it's hard work. And those of us who are intellectually switched on will realize that it's going to be hard work. We know it's going to be hard, that it's going to be grueling. Learning a foreign language is one of those enterprises that can really give you something of a sinking feeling. At least some of the time. If you're learning Japanese, sometimes, no matter how much you may enjoy it, if you're honest with yourself, there will be times when you think, man, I've got another 3 years of this, or however long it may be, before I reach a decent level. So we tend to look for an out. Just learn it like a child. Don't muck around with the grammar, don't study phonetics or phonology, don't read novels, don't create word lists with thousands and thousands of items in them. Just learn it like a child. I don't understand this bizarre assumption, implication, whatever it may be, that our brains, when we're adults, are necessarily going to be capable of doing everything that our brains did when we were children. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist. I can't quote you chapter and verse on the subject of what it is about the brain of a young child that makes it so good at absorbing languages in certain regards. I do know that young children do not yet speak any language. I don't believe in the blank slate position on human nature. I believe that our brains come ready programmed with all sorts of abilities and tendencies and dispositions, but it is certainly true that when we are born, obviously our brains have not yet been filled in with the details of any human language. Once you have learned your own native language, that obviously extends a very profound effect on the way that you will fare when you try to learn some other language in the future. Even relatively talented second or third or fourth language learners will struggle with language interference from their L1, from their native language. And this operates at all levels, right? Grammatically, phonetically, phonologically, lexically. It's always there to some extent. And then you have the input-related problems. You can't get the amount or the type of input that young children are exposed to as they're growing up. being able to go to primary school and then secondary school and then maybe university too in a specific language. This is a degree and a type of exposure to a language that is pretty hard to mimic once you are an adult, right? So I don't want to drone on about the impossibility of learning a language like a child. The basic observation that children do a lot of listening, and that we should do a lot of listening too, that observation is perfectly reasonable. The basic observation that children don't acquire the grammars of their own languages by studying grammar books is a perfectly reasonable one, but it's not reasonable to think that you're going to pick the grammar of your target language up the way children do the same thing with their native languages. A lot of people do not like studying grammar, and that is perfectly sensible. It's perfectly natural, let's put it like that. A lot of people do not like studying linear algebra, right? A lot of people do not like studying those circuit diagrams you have to do when you study physics at school, and you have to understand how the voltages are, or how the currents are, or what happens when you put three resistors in sequence or in parallel. A lot of people do not like this kind of thing because it is conceptually difficult and at times very confusing. And some human beings will shy away from that sort of undertaking. And I think all human beings will shy away from analytical complexity when it pertains to something that they themselves are not interested in, or that they don't have any time for. A lot of people like the idea of learning a foreign language, but many people don't really want to have to do what that sort of language learning entails. So the idea that you can just learn a language like a child and make it easy, that is very appealing to a lot of people. The problem is that it obviously doesn't really work at any level of analysis. It doesn't even work phonetically, phonologically. There are various phonetic phenomena in, for example, Russian, that I only noticed in an auditory sense once I had been told that they existed by people, teachers, by books, online resources on phonetics and phonology in Russian. There are things you can't hear, distinctions you can't hear. But somebody tells you that there is indeed a difference between A and B in your target language, whatever A and B may be, and you think to yourself, I can't hear that, I can't hear any difference. And then one day a little light will go on in your head and you'll think, God damn it, they really are different. You start to hear these things, but there's a limit to how much of this stuff your brain can figure out by itself. Being prompted, being primed by explicit information can be very important in phonetics and phonology. I've had Russian-speaking students, and when I've told them that the word back is not pronounced the same way as the word bag in English, they have looked genuinely surprised and confused. And I'm talking here about people who can already speak English to some extent. There are people whose ear for phonetics is operating at such a low level for some reason that even these very important phonemic distinctions are distinctions that they are not really hearing when they listen to the natives. And this, despite the fact that there are spelling differences. Back and bag aren't spelt the same way, are they? You would think people would figure out that they might be pronounced differently. Okay, English spelling is a nightmare. But nonetheless, dock and dog, you would expect people to start to consider the possibility that these words are not pronounced the same way. But a lot of people don't hear it. Dog, dog. To them it's all the same. And of course, we English speakers would have similar problems in other languages. I remember when I started learning Chinese, sang and shang. The difference between those two was not at all clear to me. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I was a bit haphazard in my approach to Chinese phonetics in that early period of my studies. And I didn't understand intellectually what was going on, and I couldn't hear the difference that well either. Don't try and learn that stuff like a child. You might be surprised by how badly you end up pronouncing a language if you try and learn it like that. No, it's nice to think that we could make it easy. It's nice to think that we could reproduce what we achieved when we were children. Though I have to point out that it takes children years and years to to learn to speak their languages properly. This is an obvious observation. This is not original to me, but it takes a long time for children to learn to speak their languages well. And to speak at an intelligent, informed, educated adult level, well, that pretty much by definition requires you to become an adult. So if you don't want to spend 18 years getting to that level in your target language, if you want to take that period of 18 years and squash it down to maybe 3 or 4, then obviously you're going to have to radically accelerate your progress relative to that of a child. And that's one of the advantages we have over little kids. We adults, to some extent, depending on the person, can squash that process down and do things much more quickly. We don't do it as accurately. We don't do it with the same fidelity that little kids do when they're learning their languages. But if we have some talent and we work hard, then we can do it quite well. And that's something to aim for. So we shouldn't get too hung up on the idea of learning languages the way little kids do. And that's before we even get on to reading. I mean, I read Game of Thrones in Russian when I was... wow, when did I start reading that? I started reading that when I'd been studying Russian for about 2 years. And I went through it so extensively, so intensively perhaps I should say, taking such detailed notes that it took me about 1.5 years to get through it. You don't expect a 3-year-old to go through any book, right? I mean, obviously the idea that we should learn like little children completely breaks down when we're talking about reading. Anyway, that was a blather, relatively unformed, unshaped, unprepared, but I just wanted to talk about that a bit. You know, much of what I said today was actually fairly obvious, I admit, but lots of people who should know better are encouraging people to just learn like a child, and you can't do that. You know, I remember my little brother, he could sort of practically wrap his legs around his head when he was a baby, but I'm pretty sure he can't do that anymore because it's something that little kids are good at because they're so flexible. By the time you're in your 40s, it's not that easy. And we shouldn't think that we can do the things with respect to language learning that we did when we were little kids either. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I do appreciate everyone who comes to the channel to listen to the nonsense I'm spouting. If you have anything that you'd like me to talk about here on the channel, I would be very happy to do so. So drop me a comment if you feel like it. Thanks very much. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.